The MCU is basically unrecognizable these days because they've gone out of their way to race and gender and do whatever kind of swaps they can with the characters to make them more accessible to a modern audience. And even people on the left are having to notice that things have changed, and it's probably not for the better. Recently, there was an article on popsequentialism.com with Matt Kennedy called "Has Diversity Led to Overrepresentation in the Media?" If you read the article, it's pretty clear that he's coming from a certain point of view from the leftist perspective. But even he has to admit that there's probably some overcompensation when it comes to diversity. And here to talk to me about that is Aaron Sparrow. How you doing, Aaron?
Doing well. How are you doing? This is not an old video, as I've said previously. I leave my tree up until almost the end of January. So everybody calm down. This is all fine.
It's not an old recording. He's just lazy. So mostly he's coming at this from the MCU perspective and kind of what happened to the MCU itself. It's a pretty big, long article. We won't talk about everything that he says, but first he kind of breaks down some of the demographics when it comes to minority representation, like how they fit into American society themselves, and starts explaining that there's absolutely overrepresentation when it comes to diversity within the MCU, and has this to say: overcompensation is a common form of restitution. It is generally acceptable to initiate some kind of affirmative action in order to right a wrong. But when the scales tip too far in the other direction, the cure becomes worse than the condition that required it, and support for such programs diminishes. Intentions of goodwill can breed resentment. While there is certainly bigotry in this country, it's an oversimplification and disingenuous to assume bigotry as a primary opposition to diversity. I think the pushback is something of a referendum on fairness, actual and perceived, and framing the complaint in these terms is much more likely to lead to better representation overall. And I don't know if it's fair or not. I don't really think of it in that terms. It's just so overwhelming at this point, Aaron, that like I said, I have LGBTQ fatigue or LGB fatigue, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting because there's a lot to unpack here, and there's a lot to think about when it comes to this. It goes back to what I've heard Mike Stacklasa on Red Letter Media say before, where he said, "You didn't notice it, but your brain did," and it's being done in such a way that when you're just trying to enjoy a movie, like all of a sudden you just start picking things out because it becomes obvious that these were decisions that were made. You can kind of see it happening. Like when I was watching Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness, I didn't really think anything about Christine being in an interracial marriage. Like that didn't really register with me. But there was a scene where like it showed the people that were sitting behind Doctor Strange and the other doctor, and they were having a conversation, and there was a Sikh, and there was like, there's like an Asian woman, and like I just saw like all of a sudden I wasn't focused on the movie anymore, but I was like, oh, here's where they were checking the boxes. Make sure we have every possible person represented, which in New York makes sense. In a metropolitan area like that, it makes sense. But on the
even
screen,
in New York, people do segregate, Aaron. People live in their own communities for the most part.
But my mind kind of like, but my mind like realized that. It realized what was happening, is that this was somebody making a conscious decision of what extras to sit where, so that we had the maximum amount of representation on the screen amongst characters that ultimately didn't matter because they weren't characters. They were just extras. They were just props for a scene. And that's really the problem, is that minorities are being used as props. They're being used as props in these films. The race bending is not intuitive. It's not done from a place of like, okay, well, how do we achieve this in a natural way? And a lot of that is because writers come from LA, they come from New York, they come from these metropolitan areas. So the modern world of today, representing the world that we see today, for them is very different than it is for everywhere else in the country, everywhere else, around different countries. You go to England and things like that, there's pockets of segregated populations because people tend to gather with people that are, of their same culture. So you take a show like Rings of Power, where they just kind of dropped in, well, we need some black dwarves, we need some Asian dwarves, we need some black elves, we need a black hobbit, that doesn't, and especially when the hobbits are described as a closed society that doesn't allow outsiders in, it doesn't make sense to have that racial diversity. You can do it in a natural way. Like, when they travel to Numenor, you could make that all Spaniards, or you could make, you could make that all, you could move, somewhere in the world where the elves are all black, and that's the place that, what is everybody calling him? Don Lemonless. That's, where Don Lemonless is from, elves that develop that way naturally because, You can do those kind of societal things and have that diversity, but metropolitan diversity doesn't make sense in a lot of unless you're in a huge metropolitan area. It doesn't make sense to do it that way.
He continues on in the article. He says, in large, diversity makes things better, but that comes with a caveat or two. It certainly has great potential to broaden appeal, but diversity for the sake of diversity and without verisimilitude will ring false, be seen as disingenuous, and run the risk of offending the intended audience. Big tentpole films have large target demographic and therefore more special interest groups therein to be catered to. Without considering the proportional makeup of the audience, it's easy to fail the core demographic while pandering to the few. Ironically, it usually comes down to the story. As long as the story rings true, features likable heroes who inspire aspiration and well-written villains with clear motivations, audiences have proven they are quite accepting of new ideas and expansive representation. If you watch House of the Dragon, it pretty much makes no sense that any of the Valerian people would be black, because we've seen the last surviving members of them that are the descendants of the people in there, and it's clear that they had no, black genes in them. It made no sense that they would have ancestors that look like that. But you can forget about that because the story is actually pretty good. They actually listen to the story's material and you end up delivering a pretty good story. So you can kind of ignore the stuff happening in House of the Dragon where you can't ignore it in the Rings of Power because the story there is so awful. It just shines a spotlight on all the other crap happening.
And like I said, it also contradicts. It's like this is a closed society, but they have all of this racial diversity within it with the Harfoots. I'm sorry, because they can't use the term hobbits. It just doesn't ring true, and your mind recognizes it. Like you take the Thor movies, and they made Heimdall black. Heimdall is not a character that anybody outside of comics really knows. As far as within the Marvel universe, nobody really knew about Heimdall. So it's not, to your general audience, that's not a jarring change. And even to me as a lifelong comic fan, it wasn't a jarring change because they didn't spend a lot of time trying to explain why it was. They didn't have to go out of their way, and they hired an awesome actor. I'll admit I'm kind of like all over the place on this issue because I do like to see diverse characters and stories, but I also like to see diverse characters from different perspectives, that's
the kind of diversity that really interests me.
Yeah, it's like that's where you get your good story dynamics from is, you can have culture clash and you can have, different, political beliefs, different religious beliefs, and these characters kind of put together. One of my favorite comics from the 90s was Silver Sable and the Wild Pack. And I think it was Gregory Wright that was writing it at the time, but he put together a really diverse group of characters in the Wild Pack. You had Chen, who always gets forgotten as the first lesbian character that was out in Marvel. It was quite clear that that she was a lesbian. Nobody ever talks about her. No, nothing happened until 2016. That was where all the firsts started. But Gregory Wright was doing it back in the 90s. So you had her. You had Crippler, who was a former Hydra agent and a sadist. You had all this. You had Sandman, who's a reformed villain and was actually kind of one of the more noble characters. You had Battlestar from Captain America, who was John Walker's Bucky. You had all of that going on, and it was a really interesting dynamic because the characters would bicker, the characters would have differences of opinion. There was conflict, and that made it interesting. Also, Gregory Wright was not afraid to write characters as characters, no matter what their ethnic background was. He could give them flaws. He felt comfortable, making them these flawed characters that made mistakes and that weren't always right, and their perspective wasn't always right. And sometimes they were just plain assholes, just like everybody is. He wasn't afraid, like so many writers are today, when they introduce a quote unquote diverse character, that they have to be these saints, that there's nothing wrong with them because they're representative of everybody. They actually got to be characters. And this is the crux of what the problem is, I think, that most people have with diversity. You're going to have your people out there who are like, I don't like seeing, those people on the screen. You are going to have a very small percentage of that, but that does not make up the whole. Mostly people just want well-written characters that are well-developed and that feel real and don't just feel like they were just dropped in and the only characterization that they have is their ethnicity, their sexuality, their skin color.
What's interesting about the article is it's a little bit all over the place. He is kind of explaining that they have overcompensated within the MCU, but then he says that's not actually the real problem, but he says it's a quality thing. It's not even the overcompensation that's turning people off. And it's like, I'm not really sure exactly what he was trying to pinpoint here. Speaking about that, he says wokeism for lack of clear definition is not destroying the MCU or the DCEU or Star Wars. Some of these films have an element of wokeness, and some of those films aren't good, but it's not the wokeness that makes them bad. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what these films are and an insistence on fixing something that wasn't broken. Phase 1 should have been a template for how to do things, but rather than build a parallel track aimed at an expanded audience while simultaneously continuing the existing story arc, a decision was made to abruptly change existing characters to fit a perceived audience that doesn't really care about superhero films, or at least not in significant enough numbers to replace the audience this new direction had the potential to alienate. He does make a pretty solid point there. I think the real problem comes in when all of a sudden you see the story decline, and you can see that whoever the writers are, the creators, are no longer prioritizing good story. They're prioritizing getting in social messaging, social agendas, and stuff like that. And the story and the characters end up taking a back seat. People get upset and they express their frustrations, and people are like, oh, you're a bigot. But really, it's just the story was really bad, and the stuff that you pushed to the forefront never really hit.
It's the difference between creating a story, like what is our story, what is our adventure, what is the action, what do the characters want, and doing all the things that you have to do to set up a good story from the beginning. And then as you write it out, you go, hey, we could touch on this, this would be interesting, this would be a nice little layer to the character if they believe this, or this is something that they're about. That all comes organically when you're writing the story. The problem with Hollywood right now, the problem with comics right now, is you've got people coming in and it's agenda first. It's like, here's my agenda. Now, how do I take the Fantastic Four, or how do I take the X-Men and wrap it around that agenda? And I don't care about writing the X-Men. I only care about writing this agenda. And I'm going to bend all of the characters in ways that are unrecognizable to people who've been reading them for years, to people who've been supporting these characters for years. They're going to be unrecognizable to them because I'm not really interested in those characters. I'm interested in telling my agenda, preaching my agenda out to everybody else using these characters as a platform. That's happening in movies. That's happening in comics. We're seeing a huge backlash against it. And because people just don't want that. Number one, people don't want to be preached to. People don't want to pay to be preached to.
It's pandering.
Definitely, yeah. And yeah, that's the other thing. You have Kevin Feige out there. He said that, I thought the Eternals was an attractive property because nobody really knows it and nobody cares about it. So we could race and gender and sexuality swap everybody. How insulting is that? Hey, hey, minorities. Hey, people with here's a bunch of characters nobody cares about that you can have. That's extremely insulting.
Well, and it's also insulting the fans of other characters that aren't being featured that probably should have been at the head of the line. Mm-hmm. Better characters out there that Marvel still hasn't introduced. But we got an Eternals movie, and obviously it bombed because it wasn't made with good intentions. Finally, he does talk about what he thinks would be the perfect vehicle to make all these changes, and I guarantee you we're actually going to see this. The perfect platform from which to launch a believable and authentic to the comic sermon on wokeness would have been in a relaunch of the X-Men. If that universe was built separately, and if Phase 2 or 3 of that universe led to an Avengers versus X-Men story, it would have allowed for the natural progression of the pre-Phase 4 MCU until it came head-to-head with the diversity by birth Marvel mutants, who have always been stand-ins for minorities of all cultures, colors, and creeds. As long as there is a deeper analogy than otherness, it could have and could still work beautifully. Right there, because of that, it won't work because they will push the analogy that you're trying to get across to the very front of it and forget that the essence of the reason why the X-Men work is because the characters are cool. It's the character dynamics. It's the team dynamics. It's the way they work together. Yes, if you were an outcast, you could certainly relate to the X-Men characters. I don't think it had to be based on gender or race or sexuality or your religion or whatever. If you ever felt like an outcast, the X-Men was created for you. And I think that's where they missed the message, where it stops being about anybody that ever felt alienated. You can only relate to the X-Men nowadays if you felt alienated because of your skin color and stuff like that.
I feel alienated, Wes, because you're using very gendered language. You're saying X-Men, and as Victoria Alonso told us, that's an outdated term.
Please forgive.
So stupid. But yeah, no, they're definitely going to ruin the X-Men. They're going to put agenda first. They're going to focus on all the wrong things. What you said about the X-Men is exactly true. It was always made so that anybody who ever felt like an outsider, anybody who ever felt out of place, could identify with those characters. And that's something that's universal. No matter who you are, no matter what ethnic background you have, no matter what your sexuality, at some point you've been in a situation where you have felt like an outsider. You felt like, you're a mutant. You're, just completely, out of touch with everybody else. No one understands you. Especially for teenagers, that's, as they're kind of like discovering who they are and trying to figure things out as they're growing into adulthood. That's what gave the X-Men so much appeal. And that's why the X-Men have been so universal. And they are going to turn it into, much like the writers that are, well, I hesitate to use the word writers, but much like the people that are, crafting the X-Men comic books today, they're going to focus on one thing. They're going to make that focus so narrow that it no longer has universal appeal. And that's going to, if they do that, it's going to hobble the X-Men right out of the gate.
Oh yeah, this thing is guaranteed to bomb before it ever really gets started. You can just tell with the direction that the MCU is going. The MCU is really in dire straits as it is, but I think the X-Men will really be the final nail in the coffin, because that's really the last, kind of big IP, the big thing that they can bring to the forefront. Even the Fantastic Four is big, but that's one team. The X-Men potentially brings in an entire line of characters in an expanded universe, and they will drop the ball on that because it's the MCU, and that's what they do in Phase 4 and 5.
Kevin Feige was just did an interview where he was quoted as saying that, the entertainment needs to come before the social messaging. And I would say that, the social messaging can just be dropped altogether. Just entertain us. That's what we're here for. That's what, that's why we're giving you money. There's things that you can touch on that are universal to all people. And that's what you should be doing. Because, at the end of the day, I truly believe, I don't like to use the term race. I think that is a stupid descriptor, because we are one race. We are all one race. We are the human race. We're all this, we're all created the same. We all have the same, love for our families. And there's so many things, there's so many more things that bind us together and make us the same than there are things that separate us. But, people like to separate us because then it allows them to grab power, and it allows them to, keep us fighting amongst ourselves so they can carve everything up a little finer amongst them and their cronies. I'm getting off on a little bit of a tangent here, but I think that, when it comes to entertainment, when it comes to a property like the X-Men, what you need to focus on are the things that bring us all together, the things that make us united, as opposed to the things that divide us.
In his article, Matt talked about how diversity is really just a really big strength. Well, I had a conversation about that with my good friend Gevian Dargan when we had It's Complicated, and we think it's a lot more complicated than diversity is always a strength everywhere at all times, any place, anyhow. Definitely check this out for a really good conversation about some of the elements being talked about in this article. You don't see the video here. There's also a link in the video description.